Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode from the RPA Vanguard channel. My name is Andy Menon. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at the first visible moving part of the solution accelerator template implementation, and that will be a simple dispatcher. So let's get started. I'm in Studio and I have the simple dispatcher template open, and we have covered the individual components briefly in the previous episodes of the Solution Accelerator series, and therefore you should have some familiarity with the downloaded Solution Accelerator template. What we'll be doing in this episode is we are going to take a look at, or a closer look at, the simple dispatcher template. And we'll be spending some time here and going to look at how UiPath has implemented this template, and understanding that implementation here and giving a little time, or dedicating a little time here, will give you a better understanding of how you must strategize the implementation of an end-to-end solution, right? When I say strategize, it means how are you going to process your data? How is your infrastructure going to be compliant with the implementation, right? For example, would it be cloud robots, or would it be, unattended robots, right? And then how are you going to preserve your data, right? Are you going to preserve it in the original format, or are you going to be, converting it from one form to the other, right? So once we have a look at this solution accelerator template, the dispatcher template, to be more specific, you can find answers to those questions, and then decide if you are going to be implementing the dispatcher in a model that UiPath has exemplified in this template, or you're going to have a much more simpler or alternate method of implementing this dispatcher template for your own use case, right? So with that, let's get started by looking at the simple dispatcher template, a bit closely. I have this template open here, and the first thing that we might want to look at is how does this template associate itself with some of the other components that you're already familiar with and that you would require for an effective implementation of the dispatcher, right? And two of those items that we have looked at in the previous episodes are the generic reusables library and the sustainability data collection reusables library, right? In the previous episode, I went into detail about how I implemented an ACM data collection reusables library for my own data. And this sustainability data collection, is the template for that implementation. And then, of course, I think 2 or 3 episodes before that, we covered the generic reusables. And as part of the simple dispatcher template implementation, you would need to compile these two libraries and then include them in this project. So with that, I'm going to jump straight back into the main.xaml of the dispatcher template. And let's take a look at each of these states one at a time and understand what each of them do. Obviously, I'm going to skip those states that are not very relevant. In this case, the most important to understand would be the init state and the process state, right? Therefore, let's first dive into the init state. I'm going to skip past all the obvious detail. These are pretty standard implementations in an init state, where your dispatcher template is starting up. In the init state, if you get into this container in the initialization parent container, it's named get transaction items. The first thing that you would want to take note of would be this note here, right? It indicates that this is an example implementation. That means you do not have to have everything implemented just as shown here. You can have your own implementation. This is just one of the solutions in implementing the dispatcher, right? So Please do take a note of it. And then the first thing that the init state does is get a path from the config file to the input file that is going to be the source of your data, right? And I have covered this before, but if you go into the config file and that config file is located in the data folder, and if you open that up, this would be a typical example file, and you will see that in the constants, there is this path to your input file path. That's the path that you're actually reading, right? And if you open that file up here, we have covered this file in the previous episodes, but the components of this file become that much more important in the dispatcher implementation. The first thing that you would want to take note of is this input file contains 3 different tabs of data, right? One is the energy, the emissions, and waste, right? Now, the beauty of this data structure is I've already covered this. This data has been gathered based on a standard. And therefore, the good part is all of these 3 data items could be handled in a standard consistent manner, right? And if we go back into the init state, we first load the file, and we then figure out if that file matches the naming convention, right? So you use a simple regex, and if the file is matching, if the name of the file is matching a certain pattern, naming pattern, then you start processing that file, right? And understanding the init state is very important because it lays the groundwork for you to understand the other parts of the entire process going forward, which is basically the performer process, right? And therefore, like I said, the incoming argument to this part of the process is your incoming Excel data, and the output is going to be the transaction data object, which is of type data table, right? But how you do that is more important, and that's what we are going to look at next. The first thing that you do is you start by creating an empty collection or empty data table called DT user data. And that is what we are doing here, right? I'm going to magnify this a little bit. And then what you do is you add a column called worksheet name. Now, this is very important. This worksheet name is going to be a driving factor for what happens downstream, right? And you add this worksheet name column to this empty data table. And next, what you do is you iterate through each of these data sheets of this incoming Excel. Fundamentally, what you're doing is you're going to loop through each of these 3 data sheets, the incoming data sheets, and then you spin up a case, right? A case statement to figure out what is the name of that worksheet that is coming in your input data, right? Let us say that it encounters the worksheet of type energy, right? And therefore the execution gets into this part of the case statement. And I'm going to expand it. And if your data sheet that's incoming is of type energy, you're going to read that entire range, read that entire sheet, right? Observe that there is no filter on the range setting here. So read range, read the entire worksheet, and read that into an interim data table named DT energy data. And just like the master user data table that you saw upstream, you add a column named worksheet name to it, right? And then you add this that column to the DT energy data table. Now, once you have added that column, this column will have a default value in it. So if I go to add worksheet data column, and if you go to the default value, you will see that it has a default value named energy. That means all of the data that's been read from this tab will have an additional column called worksheet name. And that worksheet name is going to have a default value of energy, right? And then what happens is you're going to take the interim data table named DT energy data and merge it with the master data table named DT user data. So what happens with the tab of type emissions? Again, because the data is very standardized, almost something similar happens. And it's therefore, if you understand one worksheet, the implementation style of one worksheet, it's easier to understand the other two. If we go into emissions, same thing happens. It reads the entire emissions worksheet, and then it adds a worksheet data column to that interim data table named DT emissions data. And the DT emissions data will have a column called worksheet name, and it's going to be initialized with the default value of emissions. And then you're going to merge the emissions interim data table with the master DT user data. And something similar happens with waste as well, right? So you understand one, it's almost same kind of implementation with the other two types of data that are incoming. So coming back to Notepad, this is where we were, right? We created something called DT user data, which is an empty data table. And then we merged these three interim data tables with the DT user data. And each of these record sets will be identified with different values in the worksheet column name, right? The output of the init state will be your transaction data RE framework object, which is of type data table. And therefore, at the end of the init state, you're going to take DT user data and assign it to your transaction data, right? And at this point, you have created your master transaction data set. And now that you have implemented the init state and got your master transaction data, right, which is the transaction data object, the next state you're going to move into is the get transaction state. Now, I'm going to just breeze through this because this is pretty standard RE framework implementation. There is nothing earth-shattering here. If I open up the transaction state and get into the get transaction data XAML, there is nothing fantastic. Your input argument is your transaction data, right? Which comes in as a data table. And of course, there's going to be a transaction number. And what you're going to get out is a transaction item, which is of type data row. Coming back to Notepad, you can see that get transaction state, your input is of type transaction data, and your output is of type transaction row, which is of type data row. And this data row would either be an energy type or a waste type or an emissions type, right? And this data row item will be passed to the process state. The last and most significant part of the dispatcher template implementation is the process state. So let's dive into the process transaction state. I'm in the process XAML, and the first thing that you will see here is the transformation of data that comes in as a data row. And here, the first thing you do is you generate a unique Q item reference, right? You use a GUID and you generate that GUID ID, which is unique and which identifies your item uniquely. And then you go in and you now start inspecting the type of record that you've received. Remember, you had something called worksheet name that you added to the incoming data. And therefore, that worksheet name is going to either have emissions, energy, or waste, which is something that we saw in our notes here, right? and you're going to inspect this column, and the record at any given time will be one of these. And depending on what kind of record this is, you're going to perform a data transformation action. So before I go further, let me go back and touch one of the aspects that we covered in this Solution Accelerator video series. And I'm going to bring up this sustainability data diagram PDF. And if you have watched the previous episodes, this PDF would be familiar to you by now. Before you load the emissions data or the energy data or the waste data, you require at least two objects as far as your data service entities are concerned. The first one is the ESG data information, right? This is the master record. And the ESG data information table in your data service will record the source of the data, right? And that's why it has got enterprise name, the code, what site from where this data was acquired, etc. And the ID of the ESG data information will be linked to that energy record, to that waste record, or the emissions record, right? For example, for emissions data or for energy data, for example, that's the first one we're going to look at. You will need ESG data information object, and then you will need to link that to the ESG data energy object. Remember, the ESG data energy is the actual data record, but the data information ID attribute of this data is linked to it from your master system of records, which is the ESG data information. Okay, so here we start by looking at the type of record that we have. Is it energy, emissions, or waste? And if it is of type energy, the execution goes into this case statement here. And we are going to instantiate an object of type energy data transformation, right? And this is where a very important step happens, right? In the entire data transformation, part of this process implementation. Here you will see a very insignificant step called assign, and it creates an object called queue item properties, and it instantiates a new dictionary, right? And I'm going to bring this one up because this requires a little bit of understanding. So we are in that part of the code that has encountered an energy type record, right? And what this step does in a single step, it transforms your Excel data row, the record of type data row, into a complex collection of serialized JSON objects, right? And you'll appreciate how much of it is happening in one single step. So what it does is it spawns a new dictionary of type string, object, and it uses the following sources. First, it goes into your config object and it gets the key, the data key that is specific to your energy record, right? And that comes from your config file. And you can see that here, Q specific data key for ESG energy data information. And that's of type ESG energy data information. Remember, this is your master entity, the system of records. And then it also gets the key for the ESG energy data, which is of type ESG energy data. What it does is first, it assigns that key name from the configuration file. And then it does a serialized conversion of the object of type ESG energy data information, right? Now you have the first object. Then the second object in a similar manner is going to be in config ESG energy data key, which is the object ESG energy data, and then the serialization of the ESG energy data entity object type, right? So because this record is of type energy, these two objects are valid, but at the same time, the other two records, which are of type emissions and waste, are empty, right? So a lot of that happens in a single step. And therefore, by the end of this step, you will have a dictionary containing 6 items. And out of that, 2 items will be valid and the other 4 will be empty. And the item that is valid will depend on what type of a record it is. In this case, the record is going to be of type energy data, and therefore the energy data type is a valid serialized conversion of that object. We go into emissions. Again, here you will see this step. This is now slightly different. If I bring this up, you can see that this time, this object, the ESG emissions data information, has been initialized with this key ESG emissions data information, and the ESG emissions data will be serialized to a valid JSON, right? And it's pretty obvious by now what happens when you are processing a record of type waste. And you bring this up, and this time you're going to see the waste data being initialized to valid objects, whilst the other 2 objects are empty. So by the time you have generated a queue item, it's either of type energy, emissions, or waste, with all the other objects being set to empty, right? And then you add that item to the queue, right? And here you can see that that you are going to set your path to your orchestrator folder, and you're going to assign your queue item properties and your reference, and the queue name also comes from your configuration file. So this is all pretty standard implementation, and therefore I'm not going to jump into too much detail. So by the time your dispatcher template reaches the process state and goes through the process transaction, you would have created one of the 3 queue items in your queue. It's either emissions or energy or waste. And these queue items will be picked up by the performer process and then loaded into the data service, which we'll be covering in a future episode. At the beginning of this episode, I had mentioned to you that understanding the implementation of the dispatcher template is important because it brings up a lot of questions after you inspect this template, understand it, and then you have to take some decisions, right, on whether you're going to follow this model of implementation versus a much more low-key model of implementation like I have, right? Let me tell you that there are pros and cons to both of them. And we'll go over some of the things that I have seen. There might be more, but off the top of my head, when I went through these, I was able to come up with at least a few. The first thing with this implementation model is it's really, really self-contained, right? You can see from this transformation, this single statement gives a lot of insight. What happens is once you load, once your dispatcher template comes through, takes the records from your Excel document, transforms it into serialized JSON and pushes them to the queue, your process does not need the physical data file after this state, because all of this data is now sitting in your queue. And therefore, your performer process does not have to depend on that Excel file. Now comes a con to this process. The cons to implementing it this way is you are going through multiple stages of data conversion. And in my case, if I implement it this way, I'm going to take data from Excel, right, which is of type data row. I'm going to convert it into a complex collection of dictionary that contains a complex serialized JSON. And then I'm going to store a large number of records in my queue, right? And therefore, you have gone from one form of data to another form of data, and you have to decide whether that conversion is going to be necessary or whether that conversion is going to be expensive and that you don't need it, and then whether you have to store the whole thing in your queue. And that's not the end of it. Once your performer process comes along, the performer process has to consume this complex JSON and convert it back to a form that can be loaded into your data service. And therefore, you have to take that factor into consideration before making everything self-contained and self-sustaining, right? Which brings us to another factor. This is sample data, right? Maybe 5 records, 100 records, maybe even 1,000 records, no problem. You can put it in your queue. But your queue is also driven by an underlying data table. Those resources are not infinite. You will have limits on it. And therefore, regardless of the license type you might have, you have to maintain your queues so that they are in peak operating conditions all the time, right? Now, how that's implemented, that's completely left to the organization, your automation center of excellence, and what are the guardrails that you're putting on maintaining, on implementing and maintaining your queues, right? Here, you're loading a very complex dictionary as a queue item, and imagine tens of thousands of records being loaded this way into your queue. And therefore, you have to decide how you're going to implement this. But like I said, a lot of other things come with it. And these are some of the things that you have to find an answer to before jumping onto the implementation. And I know we spent a lot of time here because I didn't want to show you how I've implemented my particular template, because my template is more traditional and you will see that in action. I'm going to run a demo in the next section, but it was very, very important for us to understand the implementation of the simple dispatcher template, because what you understand here also impacts how you implement your performer, right? All right, so I am in Studio and I have opened up my implementation of the dispatcher process. It's called ACM dispatcher process. Obviously, if you want to know what ACM is, please do look into the previous episodes. And if you compare this project with the standard template that we covered earlier in this episode, you will see that there is no reference to the data sustainables library. And that is because I'm not implementing this project, this dispatcher template, to convert my Excel data from its natural form, which is in Excel, into a queue item, which is of the entity data type. I'm not doing that conversion because in my case, I would be running this as either an attended automation or an unattended automation, and it is going to run on a robot machine, and that robot machine will have access to our file locations, right? The input file location and the output file location, etc. I will be sharing this project as part of this video. You can go in and look at it. And if you have understood the simple dispatcher template, then this one is much simpler than that. And you can go through this, and maybe you can use this as a model for your implementation, or you can implement the UiPath style of implementing the dispatcher process, right? And I'm going to go back into public documents. And here you can see that under public documents, I have something called ACM data load. In my implementation, what happens is data will come into a folder called input. And then what's going to happen is the files are going to be read, they're going to be validated. And then if the files are accepted, right, a reference is for those files is going to be written in the queue, and then those files are going to be moved into the accepted folder. And then we have to tell the performer where to find the files, right? Because you might have put in a queue item entry, but that still does not mean that the performer knows where the physical file is, right? And therefore, what happens is this particular dispatcher process will generate a report, right? And in that report, it will pass in the names of the files that the performer is supposed to process. And that report that the performer is supposed to pick up will be in the output location, right? So if we go into output, you will see that there are dispatcher report files that are read by the performer, right? And if I open a typical dispatcher report file, you will see that the dispatcher prepares a list of all the files that it has successfully put in the accepted folder with also the queue item reference and the storage item reference to that file. So here you can see that the dispatcher has accepted a file, validated it, and then it has moved it into the accepted folder and also written that reference to the queue item and then put that queue item reference here because the performer will pick up an item based on this queue item reference, and then it will find the file, right? So this is how my my dispatcher process works. It's very lightweight, right? It keeps the queue very lean, and it does not have very complex queue items in my queue, right? So I'm going to close this out. And just to make things a bit more clearer, I'm going to back up everything that's in here. So basically, after I run my test, you should see a dispatcher report in this folder. And I'm going to go back into UiPath Assistant. And I have two processes that have been deployed as attended automations, and that's obviously for the demonstration purposes. And I have dispatched them to my personal workspace folder. And if I come into my automation cloud and go into my workspace, I go into home and go into processes, you will find the ACM dispatcher process here. And also if I go into queues, the ACM files data queue is already set up here. And of course, there are no items right now. And once the automation is run, you will be able to see those new queue items. And here will be my data files. If I go into data files and go into input, I've got files coming from three states, state code 5, state code 30, and state code 80. Again, please refer to the previous episodes to see what these files are and how the data structure is set up. And I'm going to now process these files through the dispatcher process. So I'm going to just start. I'm going to hit run. And as you see, each file is consumed and it is being moved from input to accepted. And the dispatcher process is preparing the report. And if I go into ACM data load and go into accepted, you'll find those files have been moved into accepted. And if I go into output, earlier you can see that the records were empty here because I backed up the previous records. And if I open up the report file, you'll see this time it has got 3 file references, and it shows the state code 35 and 80 in no specific order. The accept status is new. And then it has the queue item references to each of these files. And if I go back into the queue and go into view transactions, I'll have 3 new items. And the references, the queue item references for each of these items have been listed in the Excel. So if I match those, you can go back and look at those references, they will match. And if I go into the detail of this item, for example, here you can see the file name of that file. It says state code 80.xlsx. And these 3 items are definitely stored in a very lean manner, right? The queue is very lean and it does not do the complex transactions that we spoke about in the default UiPath implementation. And from here on, these files will be awaiting the performer process to come in, pick these up, and then process them. And then the status of these three items will be generated in another report, which is called the performer output report, right? And you will see that in action when I run a similar test for the perform process in a future episode. That is all for this episode, and I hope that I have been able to effectively demonstrate or walk you through the implementation of the UiPath simple dispatcher template. And I hope you take the time to really go through and explore this on your own. If you have learned something new, please do like and subscribe to this channel. I truly appreciate it. Thank you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.